Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on a healthy diet. So I'd like to start off this lecture by going over these four components of what it means to eat healthfully or what a healthy diet would look like. Certainly, it's safe to say that there's no singular way that every single human being must eat in order to be healthy. So regardless of exactly what foods a person chooses to eat, there are still some tenets of healthful eating across all humans. So these four components are variety, balance, adequacy, and moderation. So we'll just take a couple minutes to explain each one of these. Variety means just eating a variety of foods in a given day, over the course of weeks or a month, over the course of the entire year. So one aspect of healthful eating that hopefully will come through over the next several weeks is the concept also of eating with the seasons. So New York State is actually a great example of seasonality throughout the year. We have obviously 4 pretty distinct seasons, and the foods that naturally grow in New York State and in the Northeast region of the United States in generally change pretty significantly from April and May on through June, July, and August, and then into the fall in September, October, November, and certainly wintertime in New York State can be sparse, I guess, in terms of what foods naturally grow in this region. So variety is to say, as much as you can, eat different foods over whatever course of time that looks like, over the week, over the day, over the year. Balance means, it kind of goes hand in hand with variety, but suggests that, we should eat a little bit of everything. We should have a balance in what we're eating. I, for example, happen to love oats and oatmeal and muesli, which is effectively like uncooked oatmeal. And I eat that almost every day. So balance would suggest that I should eat something besides oats for breakfast from time to time. Again, eating seasonally, I think, allows balance to happen pretty fluidly. So in June, I eat pounds of strawberries as frequently as I can, because that's really the singular month when strawberries grow in upstate New York. So the rest of the year, I kind of balance out my excessive strawberry intake by eating very few, right? And again, if chicken is your meat of choice, then periodically have something besides chicken. Try having some beans or some lentils or tofu or even a different type of animal meat. Adequacy is to say we must eat enough. As you've seen, or if you haven't watched the lectures yet, as you will see, we do have to eat to live and to be healthy. So adequacy is eating enough of the various foods and food groups that we know to be essential or necessary for good human health. And then moderation is perhaps the thing we're lacking most in this country. Moderation is to say eat enough. Adequacy is to say eat enough. Moderation is to say not too much. So of course, indulgences and treats and foods that we love are also important components of having a healthy diet for the long term. We also should just be a little mindful of how much of these things we eat. So, one small serving of cake at somebody's birthday, absolutely perfect, absolutely part of a healthy eating pattern. 5 to 10 pieces of cake every day, that's not enacting moderation. So these are the 4 components of healthy eating, no matter how you satisfy them or what foods are incorporated in a person's diet. These 4 components are always true: variety, balance, moderation, and adequacy. In terms of what to eat, then, again, that question can be answered a million different ways, a trillion different ways for each individual person. Again, regardless of what exactly or how a person eats, there are some basic tenets or recommendations around generally healthful eating. So in this course, we're going to focus just on the United States and recommendations that come from government authorities or other health authorities within the United States. I do encourage you to look, even just browse the internet, search on Google, but see what other countries around the world have as their national dietary guidelines. And I hope what you'll find is that there's a lot of similarities across different countries, and then there are some pretty stark contrasts as well. So in this lecture and in this course, we're mostly focusing on just what the U.S. federal government recommends as healthful eating. And then I'll draw one comparison, which is to what Harvard University, what their School of Public Health and what their medical school recommends as healthy eating patterns. And then I draw one other outside reference too, which is the World Health Organization. So obviously not looking at just one individual country, but looking at populations around the world. So from the World Health Organization, and you can just go right to their website and look up what are their healthy eating recommendations. And I just pulled these off their website. So four key concepts. The first is that a healthful diet should consist of fruits, vegetables, legumes, which are beans like black beans, pinto beans, and lentils, nuts, and whole grains. And some examples of whole grains they list are maize, which is corn, millet, oats, wheat, and brown rice. So the majority of the foods a person takes in should be in these food categories: fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, and whole grains. Next, less than 10% of total energy intake or total calories should come from free sugars. We'll get into this as we talk more about carbohydrates. In the United States, we call this added sugars. Based on a 2,000 calorie diet, 10% of that energy would be about 50 grams or 12 teaspoons of sugar. And this last bit down here is an important piece too. So ideally, this is actually less than 5% of total energy intake, which would be 6 teaspoons or 25 grams. Again, when we get into carbohydrates, we'll look specifically at what the United States recommends for added sugar intake. Less than 30% of total energy intake should come from fats. If you notice with the USDA acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, this is actually a pretty similar recommendation. And then less than 5 grams should come from salt, and that's the equivalent of about 1 teaspoon per day. And this, again, you could say free salt or added salt, not necessarily salt naturally occurring in foods. All right, so now we'll look at some of the recommendations that come from our government. So the USDA is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And every 5 years, the USDA writes the dietary guidelines for Americans. So this year, in the year 2020, the government should be writing a new set of recommendations. So the most recent to this point are from 2015 to 2020. And you can look back. It's also kind of interesting just to see how the guidelines have evolved from about the 1970s is when they were first established. So again, this is just pulled right off of the USDA website. A healthful eating pattern should, well, here's how they recommend guidelines for healthy eating for Americans. So follow a healthy eating pattern across a lifespan, very vague. I'll look in the next slide, we'll kind of suss out what they mean by a healthy eating pattern. I think important here to note is across the lifespan. So this is for the rest of time. Healthy eating isn't just a one and done. Healthy eating is something practiced ongoing for the rest of time. So we're kind of in the midst of, and have been for some time, diet crazes in the United States. And actually, maybe I should clarify, we use that word diet in two very unique ways. So diet historically means the foods that a person eats. And in more recent terms, more recent times, we use the word diet to mean caloric restriction or food restriction. So that's kind of the newfangled way to say that. So just make a note that I use the word diet for its two meanings, just depending on what I'm saying at that time. So to eat healthfully across one's lifespan or throughout the course of one's life, that is a way to promote good health for the long term. To momentarily eat healthy or to only eat healthy for a month or 10 days or 3 weeks because you're on a, quote, diet, that's not going to promote health long term. That hopefully will promote health within the course of that, quote, diet, but just eating healthfully for a few days or a couple of weeks is not going to promote health for the long term. So that's what they're suggesting here with eating patterns, is that we all cultivate healthful eating patterns, eating behaviors, eating habits, so that over the course of our lifetime, we can be healthy. Next, they suggest focus on variety, focus on nutrient-dense foods, and focus on the amount. So again, this actually kind of goes back to what we saw in the first slide: balance, moderation, variety, and adequacy. Similar to the World Health Organization, the USDA recommends limiting calories from added sugars, as well as calories from saturated fat, and again, also monitor or reduce sodium intake. Shift to healthier food and beverage choices overall, and support healthy eating patterns for all. So somewhat vague, but again, just some general guidelines that could apply to all people, regardless of what the actual foods are that they're eating. All right, so let's look a little more closely at what does a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan look like. So healthy eating pattern includes a variety of vegetables, specifically dark green, red, and orange, also beans and lentils, legumes, and choosing starchy and other vegetables. So getting again, this would speak to variety, getting a very good variety of all of your vegetables, getting a good variety of all of the colors, get a good variety of starchy vegetables and non-starchy vegetables. Eat fruits, especially whole fruits. So selecting whole fruit over fruit juice every time. Eat grains. Again, we saw this in the World Health Recommendations, or the World Health Organization recommendations. At least half of our grains should be whole grain. Again, we'll look more at this in the carbohydrate lecture in week 4. When selecting dairy products, select fat-free or low-fat. And enjoy a variety of protein foods, including seafood, lean meats, and poultry, eggs, again, legumes, beans, and lentils. Soy beans are a type of legume, but then there are other soy products like tofu, for example, and nuts and seeds. So all of these foods providing excellent sources of protein. And then with oils, include plant-based oils, and they list several, and also recognizing that oils occur naturally in certain foods like nuts, seeds, fish, and marine animals, olives, and avocados. So interesting also to just compare the US dietary guidelines to the World Health Organization dietary guidelines. And again, I encourage you to also look outside of these two and just, check in with some country that you're interested in or curious about. Canada's really close. Check out what their dietary guidelines are. If you're interested in European countries or Asian countries or South American countries, just check and see, or African countries, check and see what other countries around the world recommend for healthful eating. Alrighty, and then lastly for this particular lecture, I just want to compare, again, the USDA dietary recommendations with dietary recommendations coming from Harvard University. So on the left is from the government, on the right is from Harvard. This, I call it an infographic, the My Plate infographic, kind of goes along with the US dietary guidelines for Americans. If anyone remembers back in like the 90s, and I think even into the early 2000s, the infographic was a pyramid, and the pyramid obviously had several renditions and evolutions. In the early 90s, it was like a black pyramid with a couple like sparse icons and pictures on it. And then it evolved into like a multicolored one, a pyramid representing the 5 different food groups that you see here: fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy, kind of on a vertical axis. And then I want to say in 2010, it evolved into the plate. So just a few things to point out here, I guess. As you saw in the previous slides, I didn't really get to it, but I titled those slides Whole Foods and Mostly Plants. So here, right out coming from the US government, no matter how you shake this plate apart, 75% of the foods that we eat should be coming from plants. We can only satisfy these 3 categories: vegetables, fruits, and grains, with plant food. And then the protein category, as we also saw on the previous page, if we wanted to, could also be satisfied by plants alone. So what this is saying is roughly, at a minimum, 75% of the foods that we consume should be plant-based or plants, and up to 100% of the foods that we consume could be plants. I'll draw your attention also to the dairy in comparison to what the Harvard School of Public Health recommends. So at first glance, these 2 plates are pretty darn similar. You've got 50% of the plate being made up of fruits and vegetables. You've got 75% at least being made up of plant foods, and then you have your protein source. And then as a beverage of choice, the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, or Harvard, recommends water. As a beverage of choice, the US government recommends dairy. One thing we don't have a ton of time to get into in this course, but I encourage you to look into it if you're interested, is food industry lobbying to the United States government. So recognizing that Harvard is like an independent institution, although of course they get certain funding for what they do, the government gets a lot of funding from different interest groups, funding and again, lobbying efforts. So spokespeople from big industries and big companies going to different government meetings and councils and advocating for their industry. So that's effectively how dairy makes its way onto the US healthy eating plate, is because the dairy industry lobbies very hard for the government to get a place on the plate. Meanwhile, the dairy industry does not really lobby to Harvard, and so Harvard kind of draws their recommendations from nutrition science. And the science would suggest that dairy coming from bovine animals, coming from cows or coming from sheep or goats, is not a necessary food for human health. So rather than recommending dairy above all else, the experts at Harvard recommend water above all else. They do allow that dairy could be part of a healthful diet, but they recommend that it be limited to 1 to 2 servings a day, rather than being the beverage of choice. And if you did go to choosemyplate.gov, you would see that the USDA does write out a little more description about each of these food groups, similar to how Harvard has it here. So again, the rest of the plate being very similar. The only other difference is the healthy oils bit. So if you compare back to the previous slide, you'll see that, if you were to go to each of these sites and read more about the healthy eating recommendations, you'd see there's a little bit of difference actually between the oils that Harvard recommends and the oils that our federal government recommends. But both in general recommend limiting added oils. So that's it for this lecture. In the next one, we'll explore food labels on food packaging as regulated by the Food and Drug Administration.